Don't you know that little itch of irritation every time the word falchion is being thrown around indiscriminately, or swords are being completely misnamed? Don't you get that little bristling sword nerd deep inside that wants to go, actually? Alright, so in this video I'm going to be talking about the falchion and the messer and the difference between the two. And for the irony, I'm going to be handling mostly this thing here. It's a fantasy hybrid that I designed. Classification of swords is somewhat artificial, and they generally really didn't have very distinct terms and definitions at the time. And so you have a lot of gray area. You have a lot of cases where something was simply called a sword or a saber or a knife, and then we have to figure out, okay, where do we put this? And quite often I've seen people call a messer a falchion, but I think those types are very much distinct. Again, gray area is to be taken into consideration. But let's start out with the falchion. So this is a type of sword that was used all throughout Europe between the 13th and the 15th centuries. Now, there also seem to be a few examples from the 11th and 12th century, and if you include the Italian storta, for example, then it reaches up to the 17th century. Now, if we look at the definition, dictionary, forget about it, they're too general and vague. Mike Lodes in Swords and Swordsman classifies it as a broad-bladed, single-edged weapon with profile taper that broadens toward the point. And you can definitely find some very extreme examples of that in medieval paintings that have very, very broad blades. Now, some of them look similar to a Chinese dadao, for example. And there are variations, anything from, as Mike Lodes calls it, crude cleavers to elegant weapons with fine proportions. If you look at the Conyers falchion, for instance, that would be an example of the cleaver style of falchion. This one really has a blade profile not unlike a Latin machete. On the other hand, you have the Thorpe falchion, for example, which I've reviewed a reproduction of. Link is down below. This one here is really a more elegant, agile-looking sword. And the clip point that you see here is a common feature of this style of falchion. And there are some pretty odd, extreme examples or variants of the clip point, which are more angular and taper quite a lot. A lot of people think of the falchion as this crude, brutish chopper, but some of them were really fairly light with relatively thin blades. Now, the weight sometimes is under a kilogram, or about 2 pounds. Even the massive-looking Conyers falchion only weighed about 1.3 kilograms, or 2.86 pounds. So it's really not all that much. As far as curvature is concerned, some are noticeably curved, some have a straight spine and may appear somewhat curved because of the taper. Like all wide and thin blades, it cuts remarkably well, as you've seen in my review of the Angus Trim Thorpe falchion. Both falchions and messers are mainly thought of as commoners' weapons, but there are also some richly decorated upper-class versions, like this one made for the Duke of Florence in around 1550. And some Renaissance falchions have S-shaped quillons. The earlier ones usually have upswept, simpler crossguards. And sometimes they have a clamshell-style guard. In general, the later ones in the Renaissance make it somewhat more difficult to distinguish. Some swords of sabers from the 17th century might be called falchion or could be considered a new type. Personally, I don't really know. At that time, it gets pretty hard to distinguish, and whether you want to call something a falchion or not, it really depends. Now, there are cases where the term is misused, in my opinion. This, for example, is called a falchion here, but I think it would be more accurate to call it a dusak. So, by the way, now you can also see why the falchion in Fire Emblem is completely misnamed. This has literally nothing to do with an actual historical falchion, neither of those two versions. All right, on to the Messer. Well, I couldn't show you a falchion because I had to sell the one that I used to own. I do have two examples of Messers, single-handed and two-handed. Now, the single-handed Messer is a practice version, so it's all more rounded than what you normally see, and it's got a cord wrap. Anyway, so as the name suggests, it's of German origin. They weren't really used outside of Germanic and Scandinavian areas, and they were used between the 14th and 16th centuries. The definition that Mike Lodes offers for Messers is usually short swords with single-edged blades very similar to falchions. So it's a little bit too general for my taste, but we'll get to that. So they tend to be pretty light, quite often under a kilogram. So the name literally translates to knife, mainly due to the construction of the handle. Large two-handed versions like this were known as Kriegsmesser, which translates to war knife, or sometimes also either Langes or Großes Messer, which translates to either long or big knife. Sometimes you see an S there and sometimes you don't. That's just because of German grammar. There is a difference between if you say the long knife or a long knife. It would be a langes Messer if it's a long knife, but it would be das lange Messer if it's the long knife. So like I said, a characteristic feature of the Messer is the grip. They're made with handle scales, which are fixed either with pins or hollow rivets, and they're usually done with exposed tang, but sometimes you have a hidden tang design like this where the two handle scales are fitted so that they are joined on the sides. And you also frequently see this here, a wide groove or channel in the center of the handle scales. So it's basically like a fuller but for the grip. And this is a distinct Messer feature. I've never seen that on a falchion. Also, they don't have a large pommel. Often it's just a pommel cap, like in this case. Occasionally there's nothing at the end of the handle, and they're really defined by being asymmetrical. On a falchion, you quite often have a large wheel pommel or some other kind of symmetrical pommel here. There's usually, it's kind of hooked toward one side. Messer blades can have a variety of different curvatures. Sometimes they're completely straight, and they often have clip points, but not always, and it's especially not typical for a two-handed Messer. This type of point is more common on those, as well as straight back or drop points. Also, usually the blade doesn't broaden toward the point. Sometimes it may look like it because of the clip point, but there's generally not that much of a profile taper, which is really more of a falchion feature. Again, not on all of them. Some of them don't taper much at all, or not at all. Another very distinctive feature is the Nagel or nail, which is the side guard here that protects the hand from blade sliding down, and is often used in techniques in the historical manuals. Now, not every Messer has this. Some have rings, and a few don't have anything at all, but this is very common. Messers sometimes have a knuckle bile that reaches down from the crossguard and covers the fingers. And then there's the Bauernwehr, peasant's defense, or Hauswehr, which is home defense. These look a lot like mini Messers. They're usually short and quite often have a Nagel, but not a crossguard. Now, there are also some examples with a crossguard and longer blade, so those you could arguably call Messer, but generally I would make a distinction between the two. So this was a tool that also served as a weapon for commoners, and it doesn't look unlike the Kyber knife, for example. Messers were also used as hunting swords, and the historical fighting manuals cover them pretty extensively. Now, the classic falchion does not make an appearance in the manuals, although sometimes the word Messer is mistranslated into falchion. Alright, so to sum it up, when looking at relatively short, broad, and single-edged swords from the Middle Ages or Renaissance, if there is a symmetrical pommel fixed on top of the tang, and it has a broad blade near the tip, maybe an upswept cross guard or an S-shaped guard, that's a falchion. If it's got knife-style pinned or riveted handle scales, an asymmetrical pommel or grip end, and perhaps a hollow grind in the blade, and a Nagel, it's definitely a Messer. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule of thumb. For example, there are Messers with S-shaped guards, although the short, straight cross guard really seems more common overall. And both were used by soldiers and mercenaries, but the falchion is really a dedicated battlefield weapon, while the single-handed Messer was also popular for civilian self-defense. Two-handed, again, more for battlefield use. Alright, I hope that helped clear things up. If you're looking for high-quality reproductions of Messers, falchions, and other swords, check out the link to Cult of Athena down below. There's going to be other interesting stuff as well. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Have a good one, folks.